white supremacist regime embeds itself deeper and further into the body politic until it has shredded even the remaining vestiges of democracy? Or is there a place for the people to fight back? That's what's on the line in this election.
Local and county elections get overlooked generally anyway, but then we also have to build up the actual infrastructure or progressive machine, so to speak, to actually support these candidates so that they do have a actually shot in the community. And that takes time. And really, it's been a civic engagement lesson for the whole state and the nation as a whole.
And none of this is possible without white supremacy. Like, white supremacy really is the thing that makes it all go and makes it all possible and continually underwrites it in all these ways, whether it's Mitch McConnell talking about, blue state bailouts to, everything else all the way down. So that unless you have an analysis of white supremacy at the center of any understanding of the politics of the pandemic, then you're not going to get anywhere.
It's so transparent what one side in our political life is trying to do to the other side. And if we can't stop this and find a way for universal voting, then we will not have a democracy.
Good evening. I'm Kimberly Crenshaw, Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. And together with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, we want to welcome you to our 21st episode of Under the Black Light, entitled, If Hindsight is 2020, Why Are We Still Not Saved? The Truths That Must Be Told to Navigate the Path Ahead. The morning of January 6th began with startling contrasts in America. At one moment, we were celebrating the historic electoral wins in Georgia. And at the same time, we were bracing for the existential threat to democracy that was coming from the Capitol. And as the Peach State delivered a previously unimagined victory, America witnessed a sitting president, the commander-in-chief, urge an angry crowd to, quote, walk down to the Capitol and show strength. This mob's goal was to stop the steal and to embody and embolden Trump's call, the call that said, we will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. So how could such a whiplash of events exist within the same week, let alone the same 24 hours? What prism of understanding must we refine to see these competing events clearly? Well, first, we have to acknowledge that Trump was not alone in promoting these lies and turning them into a constitutional crisis. He was aided and abetted by congressional Republicans. Those Republicans, in turn, were hustled out and sheltered in place, along with their Democratic colleagues, when the mob took over the Capitol. Hours passed as Congresspeople and staff, Republican, Democrat alike, frantically sought rescue from the president, who, by all accounts, seemed perfectly content to let the drama play out, even as "Hang Mike Pence" echoed through the halls of our nation's Capitol. 5 people lost their lives. Notwithstanding their narrow escape, the majority of the president's party members in the House returned hours later to vote in favor of the lie that had put their lives at risk. Meanwhile, the president designated the mob to be very special people and sent them on their way with a Valentine. Most were allowed to leave after desecrating the Capitol, and to date, relatively few have been arrested. Now, on the other side of the aisle, in the face of this possible bloodbath, President-elect Biden called for unity and reconciliation, urging that, quote, America is about honor, decency, respect, tolerance. That's who we are. That's who we've always been, end quote. Now, as images of insurrectionists beating a Capitol policeman with a pole with the American flag attached to it flooded the airways, Republicans and Democrats alike have insisted that our country is, quote, better than this? So for students of history and those of us who've inherited the ugliest chapters of our past, this refrain reflects perhaps a most worrisome choice in response to this crisis. Our country's greatest conflagration and loss of life in the American Civil War came from the actions of elected representatives who set out to destroy the Union rather than risk losing their peculiar form of property. Thus, the choice to confront the intentional weaponization of the resentments, mythologies, and deceptions with homilies and kumbaya is nearly as troubling as the mob's actions that shocked the world. America wants to be better than this, but is better possible so long as we deny our past? Tonight, we ask the question then, if hindsight is 2020, why are we still not saved? As we began to think about 2021's premiere episode, we wanted to reflect back on conversations that we've been having since March, 20 episodes of this series in which we uncovered, explored, interrogated, critiqued the seminal events of the year defined by the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and by white supremacy. With the help of over 80 guests, we've deconstructed how the unfolding crises reflect vulnerabilities that are historically structured and politically reinforced, ranging from the gaping disparities in infection and death from COVID to the horrific consequences of racialized policing and punishment, all that were tragically manifest in the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Our guests made legible how politics of resentment, of white supremacy, of misogyny, xenophobia, along with lost cause politics and political repression were weaponized across the country. And we carefully examined how this election was an inflection point in the intersection of these dynamics, how democracy itself was under siege. So we wanted to lift up these perspectives from 2020 to question how that hindsight in 2021 might be mobilized to arrest these dynamics and to double down on the lessons. And then January 6th happened, raising even more sharply the question, if it is true that hindsight is 2020, what's going on? So the reason for the aphorism, hindsight is 2020, the reason it's so pervasive is that there's a belief that if we know then what we know now, perhaps we would collectively pursue a different route, a better route. Conventionally, we want to think that as part of the human condition, we learn from our mistakes. Yet the fact that we've consistently seemed to rehearse dynamics that are anti-democratic and that do not help us rise to our aspirations suggests that hindsight may not be 2020 after all, or that if it is, there are other dynamics that limit our human capacity to alter our course. Well, today we want to immerse ourselves in this moment with a prism trained on understanding not only what hindsight might be telling us, but what conditions are necessary for us to heed it. What kind of problem are we facing beyond the banal assurances that we are good people? What does it mean to resist the instinct of denial running across the political spectrum and grapple with the reflection that our nation sees when it looks unflinchingly in the mirror? Now, surely we're not suggesting that this is a simple rehearsal of the past. David Blight has warned us about this, nor is this an unbelievable set of conditions. Something else he's also reminded us that unbelievable might be the most overused word in our political discourse at the moment. We know one thing for sure, though. Our challenge is to step into our assessment of the moment, not clutching our pearls, but instead understanding that we already have the grammar, the language, the history, the cultural terrain at our disposal to understand the moment we're in. The question is, how do we navigate it effectively? How do we step back from the abyss? So, speaking of bringing the past forward, I'm thrilled to welcome back 4 of our veterans. Carol Anderson is a professor of American Studies at Emory University and the author of White Rage, which won the 2016 National Book Critics Circle Award. And her upcoming book, The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America, could not be more timely. So look out for it. David Blight is professor of American history at Yale University and the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, and other publications such as the award-winning Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory. His recent op-ed in the New York Times entitled How Trumpism May Endure is quite simply a must-read for this and any informed conversation moving forward. Anoa Changa is an organizer and lawyer and is previously the director of digital strategy and storytelling at the New Georgia Project. She is now a staff writer at Prism Reports. You can read her recent op-ed in Truth Out. Raffensperger stood up to Trump, but he also attacked voting rights groups. And finally, Joe Lowndes is a professor of political science at the University of Oregon, whose most recent book, Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race, and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity with Daniel Martinez Hosang, explores the complex racial politics of the contemporary US right, from the militia movement to the alt-right to the mainstream Republican Party. So check out our website for bios on all of our panelists. Now, throughout this live event, we want to hear from you. So please share your thoughts in the YouTube chat room or tweet us at AA Policy Forum using the hashtag Under the Black Light. So let's dive right in. So to kick things off, I've invited each of the panelists to pull out and describe an image, a piece of this puzzle. So we know for sure that this last week is going to be memorialized through so many images. We asked each of them for an anchor to come into our conversation, something that captures what a pivotal dimension of what happened is, something that they want us to understand and know about what happened. So I'm going to start with Anoa. We went into the week with a blockbuster story of President Trump's jaw-dropping efforts to persuade the Secretary of State into finding more votes in order to change the outcome of the election. And I have to say, jaw-dropping only comparatively, given what was to come during the rest of the week. So all this news coverage, the coveted feature in 60 Minutes, Brad Raffensperger was applauded for telling President Trump that the data he had was just plain wrong. We have to follow the process, follow the law. Everything we've done for the last 12 months follows the Constitution of the state of Georgia. So these statements gave him the reputation of the Republican with a spine, someone who stood up to Donald Trump and overturning the 2020 election. So we are parachuting in. How is the real story more complicated, and what image do you have for us to think about that more critically?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me here. And I know Professor Anderson can definitely chime in on this as well, but the depiction of Brad Raffensperger as if he's the people's champion or some type of great champion of voting rights and election integrity is rather laughable for those of us here in the state of Georgia who have watched Brad Raffensperger over the past, just this cycle alone, not to mention the time since he has entered office, actively engage in behaviors that undermine the election process and voting rights itself. Specifically, even though he was rejecting some of the more outlandish and egregious fraudulent statements being made by the president and by many supporters, he did engage in investigations and other actions to try and appease Republicans. So you would have heard mention, if you're paying close attention to the Georgia election, post-election during the runoff period, about 250 investigations that were happening because they are taking things very seriously on the heels of these various allegations that were being made. In fact, many of those, according to the AJC, were actually overstated in terms of their scope, in terms of the overall number. There was also Brad Raffensperger siding with the voter suppressive group True the Vote in its attempt to undermine behind several 100,000 voters here in Georgia based on the basis of filing a change of address form without any indication that people had permanently moved, whether or not they actually moved outside the county. Several counties had rejected challenges that had been mustered right before the runoff, tossing them out. And then in 2 counties, they actually had to go to federal court. And the judge, who happens to be the sister of Stacey Abrams, rightfully relying on the law, rejected those challenges and upheld the National Voter Registration Act. And Brad Raffensperger, as Secretary of State, wrote a very partisan, very blatantly false statement admonishing her decision and siding with a Texas-based voter suppressive organization that had been working with the Republican Party in order to disenfranchise voters. So there are like so many different instances. I mean, also misinterpreting law around whether or not people could engage in what's called line warming. I mean, these are just some of the different things that he's done, not to mention at the very beginning of the pandemic when he did the brave move, I think, of sending out absentee ballot applications to all eligible voters in the state. He then turned around, caving to pressure of his party a week later, and formed a criminal absentee ballot task force that consisted of primarily white conservative prosecutors with the intent of looking to prosecute people for potential fraud, including even looking at signature match issues, which many of us know signature match issues can happen for a variety of reasons, majority of which have nothing to do with fraudulent activity at all. So these are just some of the things that were happening with Brad Raffensperger that were overlooked by media looking for a hero in the Republican Party against Trump. I think if anyone would like to praise a Secretary of State for being steadfast throughout this whole process, you might want to look at the Republican Secretary of State from the state of Washington, who's been very clear and consistent from the very beginning about the fact that voter fraud, even with absentee ballot use, is virtually non-existent.
So, you know, I love the framing of people looking for a hero, right? And so people, when we have sort of just a flat idea about the good guy and the bad guy, you know, because he stands up to Trump, he's suddenly a good guy. But what we're not seeing is all of the ways in which he participated, you know, in vote repression. And if we don't see that, then we don't see partly what may be at stake now, what message people, you know, like Raffensperger or others around him are receiving. If all of the things that you've done are not enough, then doesn't that obviously push the party, you know, further to the right? Or for that matter, you know, what's the story that we're going to infer from Pence? So you mentioned Carol, so I'm going to bring her in.
Can I just note one thing about this image that's on the screen? I'm so sorry. Yeah. This image on the screen just highlights the hypocrisy and ridiculousness of the action that Brad Raffensperger took. Instead of, you know, acknowledging that there is nothing wrong with absentee ballots, which we know to be a fact, he concocted a audit process only to find only 2 mismatches, which I think Professor Anderson has more information about how those 2 mismatches came about. And it's not something insidious or you know, nefarious at all.
Yes. So thank you for that, Carol. Give me a quick lead into your billboard, and what's your take on, you know, these Georgia officials as being the saviors of democracy?
Wow. It is a really bad script that needs to be kicked back to the screenwriters. Because, I mean, and when you think about this, you've got this billboard that has Kemp and Raffensperger listed as traitors. And this is a billboard that is in Forsyth County, which is a county that had massive lynchings and then ethnic cleansing, where it just drove all of the Black people out until, you know, from 1914 until sometime in the 1990s. So that's Forsyth County. And this is saying, no matter all of the damage that you have done, all of the dirt that you have done, Kemp purges 10% of the voters in Georgia in 2018, while he's the Secretary of State running for governor. Then in October of 2018, using a thing called exact match, he removes 53,000 voter registrants from the rolls because there was some problem, like a hyphen in one part of the name didn't match up with what they had in a database. I mean, something really small and insignificant like that. Of those 53,000, 70% of them were African American. So this is right before the election with Stacey Abrams for governor. And that wasn't enough. And you think about Raffensperger, I mean, Noah just beautifully laid it out. This thing about warming the line. So he sends out, I'm going to, be charging folks with felonies. Warming the line means that in Cobb County, they reduced the number of polling stations in minority communities, significantly reduced them from the general election in November to the runoff in January. And so you had lines that were 4 hours long where people are standing in line in January and it is cold. So to be able to provide hand warmers for people, to be able to provide some sustenance for people. You see the callousness and the cruelty that is coursing through this regime that cannot and refuses to acknowledge people's basic rights and basic humanity. That is not heroism. But what you saw there in that billboard in Forsyth County was they weren't cruel enough.
Yes, right. And that's what, and that's, partly, what is so astonishing about the level of, and I'm going to use a frame that is yours, white rage, that we later saw playing out, in the Capitol and across the country. So if one would think, if there is a story about anti-democratic, processes, it would be what Kemp and Raffensperger did. It would be the vote repression that's happening across the country. It would be, Black voters and Latino voters and others who've been pushed out. But yet the rage is coming from white voters. So I guess one of the things that is sort of curious is like, how do they do that, right? How do they repress the vote, make it almost impossible for political power to be exercised by those that they don't want to exercise it? And still, at the end of the day, Trump and company are able to frame this election as a fraudulent one. It's like, how are these two things possible at the same time?
And it's because of the power, the addictive power of white supremacy. We've got to understand that. And so what that means is that African Americans, indigenous people, Hispanics are not American citizens. They don't have the right to vote. And so when they exercise that power, it is seen as illegitimate power. And so anything that emanates from that vote is therefore illegitimate, because what it's doing is it is taking away from a white power structure, what I've called in white rage a neo-apartheid state, where you have a vast rightless labor pool. And the resources from that labor are generated and moved up to a small strata of whites. And other whites believe that they can participate in those benefits, but that's not how that system works. Mm-hmm. So it's the wages of whiteness that are coming through in this. And part of that
almost like capital in the bank, right? It's something that Trump was able to use to basically buy credibility, even in the face of all of these irregularities in voting that, if anything, go the other way. I mean, it's somewhat of a miracle that the election came out its way, given how many discouraging dimensions of political apartheid continue to play out. So I want to come back to that in a moment, but let me get, David, your image, because I think it builds on what Carol just said. So what's your image that stands out from last week?
Well, I don't think this is it, but maybe you're going to put up that. There it is. I'm sorry.
She's got you. So
Yeah, right on cue.
There it comes.
I'm actually, in some ways, I'm a little sorry to have chosen this one because it's painful. On the other hand, it has already become this hideously iconic image of the assault on the Capitol. We should also note that behind the guy with the flag is a portrait of John C. Calhoun. Across on the far wall is Charles Sumner. How's that for a mixture? And then the bust is Richard Nixon, by the way, in case anybody's wondering. But the important thing about this is, and oh, there's another image, my God. When I first saw this, which was probably later in the evening on 6th January, I just had to sit down. I mean, I just thought, oh my God. And all I could think was, well, this is a new lost cause. They just assaulted the Capitol. And there they are, employing this oldest image of whiteness, of race, of slavery, of the Confederacy, of being a rebel and all of that. And then it actually became the first sentence of this op-ed I wrote over the weekend. There's a new lost cause possibly evolving. Now, we shouldn't forget also that mob had all kinds of flags, didn't they? They had the Gadsden flags. They had the, which are the Don't Tread on Me flags. That's the appeal back to the revolution. That's what the Tea Party invoked. They had zillions of Trump flags and then American flags. Think of the mixture of there they are. Having a frolicking good old time, aren't they? Now, we should remember, though, that lost causes have patterns to them. They almost always prepare people to some degree for violence. They are rooted in big and little lies, but they're generally rooted in big lies that become deep kinds of myths, kind of anthropological style myths, narratives, stories that people come to hold as beliefs. Doesn't matter what facts or evidence may be thrown at them. They become beliefs in search of a history. And that's what these people are. I cannot begin to explain these conspiracy theories. I still can't understand. I've read a lot about QAnon, but I'm having still a hard time getting my head around it. But they hold beliefs. They don't tell you any facts about what happened in the election in Georgia or the election in Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. They just tell you they don't believe that a Republican could have lost. They just tell you that Georgia is not blue. They just tell you that Trump won in a landslide. So, beliefs can be empowering, but beliefs can be extraordinarily dangerous. And lost causes also have to be passed on to next generations. They have to have iconography. They have to have symbolism. They're most effective when they tend to have one or more iconic, almost saint-like heroes, martyrs. This lost cause doesn't yet quite have a martyr. I'm not.
And do you think Trump cannot be that? Like, he's not going to be like Robert E. Lee, who is the martyr, basically the representative of the lost cause.
I want to be careful with historical parallels. I don't think he can become a Lee in the sense Lee did. For after all, Lee was a soldier in a war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. So he could wear that, so to speak. And he also died before they made all this myth about him. But I don't know. I mean, it's hard to predict. However, if there he is, God, if this guy gets tried in the Senate, still, guess there may be a trial, but if he gets tried, and let's assume he is convicted, maybe they get 17 Republicans to vote for this because they're so determined to get him out of the way and declare him ineligible to ever run again, then he's more of a victim then than he even portrays himself now to that so-called base. And that's why this is a delicate thing to manage. not only about that trial, but it's such a delicate problem for Joe Biden and his team. How much do you come into office preaching a kind of necessary healing and unity, and how much do you come in with a clenched fist?
Yeah,
How much of this is unity and how much of this is going to be justice and retribution? That's a tough thing to manage, but we've got to have a lot of both.
Yeah.
Because it could determine just what kind of figure even Trump becomes in that, what Lindsey Graham called, let's not forget, he called Trump a movement.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So,
and so
let's hope it doesn't become a lost cause and it just flares out like the bad TV show.
Well, that is truly the question. And so, some part of looking back, and we'll come back around to this because I want you to talk a little bit about race and reunion as well. But, there, looking back, we can see the moments where, as you pointed out, like Robert E. Lee became, this figure. We have a sense of how women were the holders of this. The generation after the generation that lost, felt like it was, their reason for being to elevate this story about, not treason, but, fighting to protect their way of life. So we can see the moments where lost cause actually took a hold of our culture and our memory. And to a certain extent, you still hear echoes of it. Can we learn anything from that to know these are inflection points, right? This is, and part of what I hear you saying is, potentially, the trial might be one of those moments that we have to think about. So I'm keen to understand where this history tells us. I'm also keen to understand who these people are. So Joe, I want to come to you and get your image for a moment, in just mainlining, the news cycle, you see so many people struggling with the idea of this can't really have been that much of a threat because it was like a carnival and people were having a good time, and really doesn't look like white supremacists because, look at all the women that were there and the young couples and some people of color. So, there's this image of what people think a real threat is, and then there's what's actually there. So give us a sense of your image and what you want to tell us about, among many things, your prognoses for redirecting some of these energies.
Yeah, so I chose this image because it's important to remember that, this event happened in DC on January 6th, but it really, this kind of the radicalization of the Republican Party, already a right-wing party. We have to remember, I just step back for a moment to say that, the modern GOP itself, since the 1960s, has been fashioned on opposition to Black civil rights and Black freedoms. I mean, that was the basis of the Goldwater campaign in '64. It was the basis of the Nixon campaigns in '68 and '72. The basis of the Reagan campaign in 1980, on and on. So there's a way in which this is, baked into the very identity of the Republican Party. But I think the move to the sharp right is something is a little bit new and something we've now seen develop over the last 4 years. But even, in the last 3 or 4 months, this kind of radicalization permeates state and local Republican organizations all across the country. And this, the call to action, the call to both to protest at state capitals around the country and to come to DC, were passed around by Republican officials, party officials, and sitting elected officials all over the place with violent language, kind of. I wouldn't call it insurrectionary language. I would call it counter-insurrectionary language. And all this stuff is going to be really hard to undo because it's deeply in Republican culture now, and it's tens of millions of people. And so, I think partly what we have to remember here is that even when we want to use terms like terrorist, we're actually really dealing with a really broad swath of the American public who are now enlisted with QAnon ideas, with conspiratorial ideas, with deep white supremacist beliefs that are, activated and sharper than they were, and the actual organizational power of groups like the Oath Keepers here, or the 3% Militia, or the Proud Boys, other state and local paramilitary organizations, and others that actually have real, Ammon Bundy's People's Rights Network, with groups with real organizational power, and real firearms training and real explosives training. And many of these folks are veterans of the forever wars that we've been having for the last 20 years. And so we're really facing something that's quite dangerous, I think, in many ways. And I don't think there's any easy answers. But I would say, maybe in response to David, I guess I'm a little bit more in the clenched fist camp. I don't think it's possible to enrage these folks anymore. I don't think it's possible to alienate these folks anymore. I don't think it's possible to make the people who thought that this was a stolen election feel like things have been made more unjust for them. I think on January 6th showed us where this movement is. And, I was thinking, I joked to somebody today, Stephen Scalise made referred to Lincoln's second inaugural address to make a call for unity during this impeachment vote. And, he seemed to have forgot the part about the, every drop of blood, brought by the lash has to be repaid by the sword.
They always leave out the whole long middle paragraph.
Exactly.
Indeed. And I would say to the extent that there was any silver lining, I kind of thought, maybe it's me, I kind of thought if my boss had thrown me under to the crowd, and allowed a crowd to come in, calling for effectively me to be lynched, didn't show up, didn't answer my call, just left me hanging out there, I would think, well, at least what time it is. You are utterly clear about the fact that you're completely and totally expendable. And I kind of thought that for the other Republicans in the gallery. They kind of knew that help wasn't coming, at least not fast enough. So I have to say, I was it's hard to be surprised. But I was surprised about how even an assault on the Capitol that put their lives at risk wasn't enough for them to censure this president, and that makes me even more in your camp, Joe. I don't see what the logics are that we can rely on to try to change this trajectory. So, when people are really into, well, what do we say, to bring them back from the edge, I'm coming up short. And you've researched it more than most people I know. It sounds like you're coming up short too.
Yeah, in some ways, the Republican Party is it's a far right party in the kind of Central European model, and these days. And it's also not clear that Republican House members, to the degree in which they may have been involved in planning any of this, there are Democratic House members who seem to think that their colleagues were involved and they didn't trust them on that day, and they were worried about what was happening. A Democratic House member from New Jersey said last night that on the day before, on January 5th, there were Republican House members leading activists on reconnaissance tours through the Capitol. So, what this actually looks like, and, what levels of commitment there are, even among Republican House members, to what happened on the 6th, I think it remains to be seen. But it sounds like from accounts that are now really starting to come out that it's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
Hey, Kim, I want to make sure I'm not cast into the only healing camp, because I'm not.
I know you.
I'm actually with Joe on this. I'm for a
and we'll come back around.
All right.
In fact, as soon as we come back from the break, because your your work on race and reunion tells us all of the reasons why.
Too much healing is a dangerous thing.
Exactly. So we'll talk about that. But first, I want to ask Owoye Tempo to give us a bit of a rundown about what we've been hearing online so far, and then we'll move to the next segment. So Owoye?
Hi, thank you so much, Kim. As you can imagine, so many people are just really overjoyed to be able to have this space, to be able to gather today, given everything that's going on. People are joining in from all over the world. So thank you so much to everybody who's in the chat. One person entered the conversation with a meditation saying, given the events last week, we must stare into the abyss with clear eyes and a strong will. Someone else soon after recalled the Great Compromise of 1877. There's actually a bit of a strategy session happening in the chat today. People are asking big questions like, how do we culturally change the minds of 74 million people? What are some of the images that people are thinking of when it comes to the past week? And can our country be better than this? There's lots of agreement with you all regarding the situation with Raffensperger, with one person saying we have to stop celebrating these mediocre folks because they made one decent moral decision at one time. And there's a lot of comments actually about media and media influence, people saying things like media framing is a big part of the problem here, or we need to invest in our own media outlets and use our power to make them leading platforms. There's calls for local journalism, and a couple other comments that stood out. One person said, we have a civics problem in this country. These people don't have a clue what being an American citizen is all about. And another person commenting, addictive power, it's the hardest drug to quit. And lastly, just speaking of heroes, there are many shout outs saying the heroes are the Georgia grassroots organizers, and the real hero in Georgia was Stacey Abrams, and Georgia organizers and Georgia voters threw down. So that's what's happening in the chat, but we'll toss it back to you.
Thank you, Owoye. Thank you, everybody, for joining the conversation. This is exactly why we do this and what keeps us going. So thanks for being part of it. So I promise we will come back and talk about the dangers of appeasement and talk about what the lesson of the past should be for now. And to get to that, I do want to talk about historical moments that may be resonant with us now that we've seen what happened. So I want to go back to, something, David, you said when we were together last time about the Wilmington riot. So, and I've revisited since then, and part of what was so shocking to me was the fact that this isn't part of our historiography. We don't know this. People don't tell, the story of not just that coup, but other coups. And so it really came out for me when a lot of people were saying, well, did you think that they were really going to kill anyone? Or did, come on, they were going in to make their voices heard. And I wanted to say, do you know the stories of, angry, entitled, largely white men with guns, feeling like people were exercising power who didn't legitimately have the right to do it? Have you any idea what has happened in the past? So, of course, there's Wilmington, there's Colfax, there's all of these, other moments. I'm wondering what you think of the fact that so many of these were based on a huge lie and were constantly repeated and rehearsed and repeated and rehearsed, so that the organ that we rely on to be the great truth teller, the media, journalism, they were as much part of the problem as the guns were. It doesn't seem like we've learned that lesson, or we talk about this at all. Does that concern you now that this lie has been manufactured and reproduced, and our media haven't been able to intervene or interrupt in any significant way?
Oh, God, yes, it concerns me. I mean, just to start with that point, I mean, to me, of all the outrages and now crimes that Trump and his minions have committed in the past 4 years, rendering evidence, facts, and truth essentially irrelevant, maybe their greatest achievement. I mean, here we all are, we work in universities or journalism, and we deeply believe in the role of science, of evidence, of facts, of truth when we can find it. I mean, it's our lifeblood. It's what we do. But what we've learned is that there are millions and millions of people who have beliefs. It doesn't matter what truths are. And I noticed you put that word truths and truth up at our beginning here as part of your wonderful opening narrative. But just to make a quick point out of that Wilmington story, since you asked, it is too little known, although there are some fine books on it now. The book by David Zucchino recently, it's been out a year or more. I reviewed it in your review of books. It's incredible, a great narrative writer he is. He's a journalist. But that episode was actually a political revolution in the name of white supremacy. It was led by various white Democrats in the state of North Carolina. Well, there we got a historical marker. All right. It was led out of Raleigh by the newspaper, the Raleigh News and Observer, which is still there. And 70 some years after the fact, oh, more than that, actually, 80 some years after the fact, finally issued an apology. Then it was led by the political leadership of Eastern North Carolina. And what it simply was an attempt that succeeded to throw out black politics, black politicians, black city council persons, and so on and so forth, black policemen in the city of Wilmington, which in 1898 was the largest city in North Carolina, by the way. Its congressman from that district was a black man. He was the last surviving black in the United States Congress. 2 or 3 members out of 6 or 7 of the city council were black. It was what was known as a fusion. There he is. Wow, what a team you have, Kim. Amazing. But
my team is loving the fact that you're loving the images.
You bet, man. I wish I taught with them more often, man.
We can arrange something.
Okay, you're on. Tell me your price. But anyway, their effort was to take over Wilmington and then take over the state and to eliminate black political activity and the right to vote. They killed approximately, we may never know exactly how many. They killed about 30 people in the process in 2 days. They drove hundreds more African Americans out of Wilmington forever. And for the next 60 some years, North Carolina came under a Jim Crow white supremacist regime that was celebrated over and over. And what we have to admit about Wilmington, which is what we're beginning to admit now about 6 January, and that is that it was explicitly for the purpose of destroying black politics and black citizenship in the interest of white supremacy as a permanent dream. And, I think through the Trump years here, we've wanted to wish this away. We've wanted to say, well, he's going to flare out. He's just too stupid. At some point it's not going to work, and so on and so forth. It really worked. 72 million people vote. They didn't all vote because of white supremacy. They got plenty of reasons to vote for Trump. There are plenty of things they hate, or plenty of things they wish for, like their tax breaks and their increasing stock portfolios and so on and so forth. But the Wilmington case, people should read about it, is in effect, I called it in my essay about it, an American pogrom. It was an effort to destroy a community, its political life, its economic life, its very essence. That photograph is the former office of the one black-led newspaper in Wilmington, which was burned in the Wilmington coup.
And David, the 2 things that stand out to me, so much, and I'm going to go to Carol to get her to also share something about the big lie. 2 things that are particularly intersectional about it. First, This was a counter-revolution against what contemporary race class people call for, fusion politics. This was a biracial, sort of the perfect solution. When people say, well, what about class? That was partly what was going on. People say, well, articulate your vision for democracy in a way that is broadly inclusive. That's what these politicians were all about. And it was that fact that it was a winning strategy that made the white supremacists so determined not only to relieve them of power, I mean, they effectively relieved them of power, but then murdered them, to make sure that day would live on, in infamy. And the other intersectional piece that, people are just starting, to talk about. Crystal Femster, love her work. But it was prompted in part by speaking back against the myth of Black male rape of white women, pointing out, that it often wasn't even claimed, much less did it not happen as the justification. And in fact, what was actually consensual sex, both between Black men and white women, was also going on, as well as the fact that there was, in fact, interracial rape, but it was largely white men and Black women. Just saying that was so enraging that they were able to hold on to that and use it at precisely the moment that they knew that they could bring people from all around to enact this horrific massacre. So Carol, I want to come back to you because we've been talking about lost causism and lies. What is, if we were to say, what is the master lie that undergirds white rage that we've seen play out again and again and again? How would you articulate the master lie?
I would say that and so let me define white rage.
Yes.
Because we often think of white rage when I say that as the kind of violence that we see. But white rage, when I'm talking about it, are the policies that are put in place to undermine, undercut Black advancement towards their citizenship rights. So this is why we have Black codes after the Civil War. This is why we have massive resistance after Brown, the war on drugs after the Civil Rights Movement, Donald Trump after Barack Obama, with all of the policies that come in place, voter suppression after Barack Obama. And so the lie is that Black people are not citizens and they do not have rights. That it's like Dred Scott, that African Americans have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And so when you see the kind of mobilization and organizing that is happening in the Black community to gain hold of their rights, it is enraging. And that rage then comes up in terms of these policies. And one of the things that those policies do is that they then also sanction, approve the violence that rains down on Black people. So one of the things that we saw happening after Wilmington, when I think his name, Charles Aycock, steps in, who was one of the ringleaders in terms of the coup, the bloody coup in Wilmington. When he then steps in as mayor, the governor of North Carolina was just like, hi, Mr. Mayor. So, none of this, you've killed folks, you are a mass murderer, you have overthrown a democracy, we're not having it. Instead, you get the stamp of approval, the stamp of legitimacy onto the kind of violence that rains down on Black communities. And so that is part and parcel of the framework that we're seeing.
And this is a governor, by the way, who was elected largely as a fusion candidate, right? So,
yeah.
Right.
In fact, Aycock was the guy always in the background, never participated or planned the violence. He kind of kept out of sight in that sense and was available to be now the mayor. And we've had some figures like that too, haven't we? At times.
And so if as you say, Carol, also in your book, that, you know, like night follows day, the resistance to a success, right? The way up is what engenders the violent reaction. And we've seen that both in Wilmington, but also in Tulsa. And some would say the election of Barack Obama, which was a moment that fueled both the celebration, we're post-racial, but also this deep resistance response on the other side. If that is a dynamic, then what can we expect, or what do we think is going to happen as a result of, first of all, Georgia being flipped? So this is a significant moment. And Anoa, I guess the question is this a story about the repudiation of lost causism? Is this you know, folks of color in the South saying we're here too, and this is the story that we want to tell, and this is a future that we're standing by? So, you know, on the grand scheme of things, what kind of victory is it that we're looking at in Georgia?
I mean, I think we're looking at a story or a victory around the resilience of collective power and action when people come together in coalition to make sure that their needs and the needs of their communities are actually being met. When we look at Georgia, Georgia's a state that has had, I think it's 9 rural hospital closures in the past few years. We don't have Medicaid expansion, and Brian Kemp as governor, you know, has basically entered an agreement with the current, you know, the outgoing administration to do away with the ACA exchange here in Georgia. Now, some states have their own exchanges for the ACA. Georgia's like, hey, we don't need an exchange at all. We're just going to throw people out to the wolves in the free market. And it's that type of, you know, and these are issues, you know, around healthcare, education. There are issues that have bipartisan support in terms of voters across the state. And yet we have a Republican government that is making decisions based on their own needs and power grabs that are not meeting our issues, that are not meeting our needs and concerns. And so we see, you know, Georgians, whether it's the race in terms of, you know, Reverend Warnock and Jon Ossoff, or, you know, even people organizing back in 2018 to elect Stacey Abrams as governor, because people foresaw some of these issues, some of the similar things around criminal justice reform and the steps that Brian Kemp and others have taken to undo bipartisan reform in the state, even trying to escalate criminal justice attacks on young people by trying to expand the gang database. So we've seen organizers grinding really hard and trying to build not just how do we get more people to turn out for this particular election cycle, but what does it mean to build long-term civic engagement and capacity building so that people are not just casting a ballot, I voted, I'll be back in 4 years, but really understanding the reason why we need to be a part of the process for the long haul. And so we see organizers, not just in, you know, some of the metro centers in the state, we see people down in places like Cuthbert, Georgia, you know, which is in Randolph County. And if folks remember in 2018, Randolph County, Georgia was targeted for a closure of 7 out of 9, I believe it was, of its polling locations. This is a predominantly Black county. And Brian Kemp sent someone to that county to do these poll closures. And then we later found out that he had been encouraging more poll closures around the state. So we're seeing the resilience of rural Black voters and other voters of color. They're really stepping up and saying, hey, we exist, we're here too. We just need some tools, get out our way and watch us work. And that's what we've seen around the state. And we've seen the rising power also of, you know, Latino and Asian American voters who are part of this brilliant coalition that has been built in Georgia. And it's not saying the way it gets, you know, Democrats are like, we need to win back white voters and we can't lose white people. We're not losing white people. White people who are choosing not to vote a certain way are, you know, choosing to vote against their own interests, for lack of a better phraseology, right? There are white people who are part of this coalition, but we're also recognizing that there are communities that need the full faith and protection that is afforded to us under the Constitution in this so-called democracy. And we're going to organize and make sure that happens.
So, you know, I want to pick up on, especially, you know, the question about that always is going to come up, like, progressive organizing, where are white people? So let's just say one thing, that this is a coalition that does have white people in it. And when we're talking about white people, we're not talking, I hate that I have to even say this, but I'm always getting people who say, what about us? So we're talking about ideological whiteness, people whose allegiance is directed to and embraces the idea of whiteness. So obviously that doesn't involve everybody. And at the same time, obviously it is a tremendous political force in American society, more now than some people would be willing to have admitted, I think, over the last decade. So on that question, I want to remind us of how we've talked about whiteness in the past. And Joe, I'm coming back to you on this because, we had a conversation about a disaster, COVID as an opportunity for disaster whiteness to happen. We've talked about, the fact that the frame of, well, what we need to do is talk about common interests. When we talk about common interests, as opposed to identity politics, people will come back to our conversation. Well, here we have a moment where we have had an effort to militarize something that is a common interest, basically protecting us all, each other, and ourselves against COVID. That's become militarized and framed within a discourse that at least has some dimension of whiteness, if not, completely so. We have, a hope that, well, once we convince people that the whole planet is on fire and we have a common interest, people will come along on that. Not so it seems. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what is the political logic now that underscores our efforts to build common cause? If all rationality and all belief in truth is off the table, then what is on the table right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing, thinking about the 19th century, it kind of occurred to me that, one bright spot that happens after Wilmington, by the time you get to the 1890s, is the emergence of Black populism in the South. And this was a, self-directed, autonomous movement by laborers and farmers to push back against the planter elite, the bourbon class, and as well as the larger interests that the populist movement more generally was going after. And in places like Georgia and Florida and Texas, Black populists really made the difference, and other white organizers and whites in kind of other organizations connected with populism knew that they required these fellow political participants to make this thing happen. And so I think one of the things about right now, the way to think about it, I think if we think about just like what's everybody's common interest, in a country rooted in settler colonialism and white supremacy, you can't have that kind of conversation because it just erases all this stuff, that real material and real forms of difference and stratification and disparity. On the other hand, Black-led struggle over the last 6 months has been something that has given, as is always the case in American politics, offers something much more broad in terms of democratic horizons and freedoms to everyone else. And so, a summer of Black Lives Matter protests, the largest social movement in American history, in every city, every town, every hamlet across the country, really pushed forward and mobilized millions of people in the streets. And part of this energy went into the election cycle in November. Part of it is, was a broad set of mobilizations that really have kind of like, look at Georgia. It saved us from Trump, and these were Black voters. And it's the same in Pennsylvania. It's the same in Wisconsin. It's the same, in other states around the country on election day. So I think that the relationship between social movements and elections, and the particularity of Black struggles of people of color generally, struggles of workers generally as well, I think are important here. And these are the kind of things we need to look to both for inspiration, but for actual strategic cues of where to go next.
On the strategic question, and we're going to take just a quick break and just see what our listeners want us to address in our last 20 minutes. But I do want to push us on, you know, as David said, we're fact-based people. We engage in, you know, analysis from ground up. You know, we try to make arguments based on, you know, assumptions of, well, you know, people are going to be responsive to things that advance their self-interest. And I mean, that's what, you know, our political system is sort of based on. And I'm just wondering whether all of those assumptions are off the table for a period of time, whether the things we fall back on, you know, just maybe aren't there anymore. And the idea of negotiation and reaching across, I mean, what are we gonna do with all of this stuff when, you know, there basically is a party that was perfectly willing to let something go down that we thought we'd never see. So when we come back, let's delve into that for our last 20 minutes. Awoye, what's going on in our little ecosystem? What are people talking about?
Thanks so much, Kim. There's actually quite a few comments on the number of police who were involved on Wednesday. So there's a lot of conversation around that. There's some thoughts about the Wilmington activists who are currently trying to save the Wilmington Journal, which was created because the Daily Record had been burned down. And then a couple of other comments and questions. One comment was, funny because so many Trump supporters argue how BLM wants to erase our history and destroy our monuments, but so much of our history is whitewashed to support an American mythology. A number of questions that came up in response to the earlier question of, can our country be better than this? Thank you to our very own Gina Best for asking, was the country ever better than this? One person wanted to know, do you all have any advice for students advocating their boards of ed to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion into the curriculum so that it can make sense of the history as it relates to the present day? One person asked why people often tell, particularly Professor Anderson, why they voted for President Obama and then switched to Donald Trump. And lastly, another person asked, how can we fight COVID and white supremacy at the same time?
More than a notion. Thank you, everyone. These are great questions. So this is kind of our lightning round. So we're going to try to get as many quick responses as we possibly can as we push towards the conclusion. I want to start with the question of the police and, of course, say something about this use of say her name to frame Ashley Babbitt. So there's, I think, actually quite a debate going on about how we think about the actions of the police. I'll just say her name is explicitly framed as a way of elevating the failure to address the experiences that Black women have had with state-sanctioned violence. And so it is amazing to me that over the weekend, one of the supporters of Say Her Name, Drew Brees, had a Say Her Name t-shirt on. And there was tremendous controversy around it from all sides of the spectrum. I just want to say that the Saints have been supporting Say Her Name, supporting the attention that it tries to bring towards Black women who've been killed by the police and their families. And it is just another example of what happens when Black people are gentrified out of the places that they've created for themselves to be seen and to be heard. So on that note, what do we make about the arguments that have been made, first of all, that try to create symmetry between Black Lives Matter and what happened in the Capitol. I want you to say something quickly about that, Carol. And Joe, what about police? What about police participation in this in this right-wing movement? Is it new necessarily? So, Carol.
So I would say that what we're seeing is that false equivalence, trying to make a movement that is about going after state-sanctioned violence against Black people, to try to make that on par with trying to overthrow a government. And so you hear them also saying, but yes, Black Lives Matter, they were so violent. Again, when you're not evidence-based, BLM hasn't killed anybody. BLM hasn't blown up anything. And the reports are really clear. The violence that happened overwhelmingly this summer was because of the escalation by police in going after nonviolent protesters. So, and when we saw they were doing the thing in Minneapolis, when it came out that it was actually like the Boogaloo Boys or the Proud Boys who were actually shooting at the precinct and trying to blow stuff up there where the police were, to give the illusion that it was in fact Black violence, because one of the narratives, one of the big lies in American society is the violence of Black people. And so it becomes so logical to say, well, Black people are blowing up stuff. This is what Black people do. This is what Black people are. And so it is again a throwback to Black pathology to justify the mess that happened.
And we have to, of course, add to the fact that many comments about why the police and the security that people thought should have happened didn't happen was partly because there was a dismissal of what this threat represented, the sense that, these are basically people who talk a lot, but they're not going to do anything. Whereas Black Lives Matter, of course, there is the long history of associating Blackness with a threat and with violence, even though Black Lives Matter has never called, for killing anyone, has never encouraged people, to come out and wreak havoc. It is none of the things that we saw even on the posters, much less the things that people have talked about. Yet the FBI has framed Black identity extremists as being the same as these extremists who are actually now responsible for killing people. Yes. So actually in our so-called security plan, there is this false equivalence that I don't see as anything but racist. And it's still very much part of how Black protests and demands have been seen. And Joe, what should we make of the fact that there is significant involvement of law enforcement in this attempted coup and in the broader movement?
Yeah, well, I think at last count, there's 28 sworn officers who were part of the takeover from 12 states, and at least one member of the Secret Service who was, either deeply involved in this or promoting it over social media. I mean, there's been plenty of reports that white supremacist organizations have, infiltrated or saturated or long have been part of local police departments. And of course, as we know, the very origins of the police in the United States are partly based on slave patrols and frontier militias, anti-indigenous frontier militias. So there's something about, white supremacy, which is at the heart of what policing is anyway. But it's also interesting to see the way that the people in the Capitol takeover treated the police, yelling at them, "You work for us, you work for us," which is not, a way that other people would ever approach the police. And they were willing to attack the police when they saw them not doing what they thought protecting their white interests and protecting their interests in that moment. So I think this is out here in the West, you see it all over the place. There's 6 sheriffs in Oregon who are part of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, who take a vow not to enforce federal laws that go against what they think are in the interest of the county. Often these have to do with Second Amendment things, but it's not just that. And so there's this kind of thing is and not just in local law enforcement. This stuff is in the FBI and elsewhere. But I think, and also the Police Benevolent Association have been strong Trump supporters for the last 4 years. So and they're probably the most far right, maybe proto-fascist organization in the country in some ways. So the role of police in this is troubling, to say the least, I would say.
And I would say, again, the contradiction, right? So there's no flag flying at half-mast because of a white police officer being killed. It is consistent with the fact that there were police officers who were injured by the right during this summer of reckoning, and there was virtually no sort of Blue Lives Matter protest around that. So I think that moment of "you work for us" tells us a lot about when the police are being embraced and when they're not. It's basically what interests they are serving as opposed to just being police. No, I want to sort of come to you and raise something that Latasha Brown said when she was here before, when we were talking about Southern rule. And she was saying that the Senate under Mitch McConnell is a moment in which we are all learning what Southern rule really is all about. The whole country, everything south of the Canadian border is basically under Southern rule. So what lessons do we now move thankfully away from this last period of the whole country being under Southern rule? What lessons do we move away with that might give us a window in how we survive and try to recapture a future that has been taken away from us?
I don't know if you aimed that at me or not, but I'll try.
Oh, I was actually, because my one for you,
okay.
I got a different one for you. It's about reconciliation. So this one is for Noah, but I'm coming back to you on reconciliation.
Okay. Go ahead, Noah.
Noah, you've got the floor. Have we lost her?
There she is. She's coming.
I'm back.
Yeah. Oh, so we did lose you. So my question is, what lessons can we learn? We've all been under Mitch McConnell for too long. We look to Georgia. We look to activists under Southern rule to give us the lessons that we need to foreground in the work that we have ahead of us. So if there's one thing that we can learn from the Georgia experience, what would it be? I think we've lost her again.
I think so too.
I do not think Comcast likes me very much this evening.
Oh, well, we've experienced that before, so.
Oh, yeah.
Totally understood.
But I think I got most of the question about lessons that we can learn from Georgia and being under the clutches of Mitch McConnell over the past 6 years and looking forward. I just know, like, with the new, senators, hopefully who will be seated soon, that we can look forward to, moving some really important pieces of legislation forward. The Voting Rights Advancement Act has been sitting for about a year. And that's more than just a replacement of the VRA. I mean, the Voting Rights Advancement Act actually also considers many of the issues that have come up since 2013 and the Shelby v. Holder case, and really correcting some aspects of elections that'll help ensure people have free and fair access to the electoral process and democracy as a whole. I mean, I also really look forward to seeing, support for the MORE Act, not MOVE Act, MORE Act, which the House voted on at the end of last year, which would legalize marijuana, or decriminalize actually marijuana at the federal level, possibly paving the way for legalization in more states around the country. So, I mean, just the opportunity to have real discussion of issues affecting people across the country. I don't think how many people really understand what Mitch McConnell has obstructed and kept from us, including as we're still in the middle of this pandemic and the meager assistance that has been provided. That has been something that has been used as a cudgel against Democrats, against the American people. And hopefully we will really see some traction and movement. So I think the lesson from Georgia is that we can run on bold issues. We can have leaders who stand firm and represent the people and still win. When we listen to a coalition of folks who are really firm and strong, and we speak from the heart.
And with that, of course, is the space that may be opened up by our incoming president. So, David, what's the lesson of reunion and appeasement? You took readers through scene after scene about how the desire to make up and make nice literally threw Black people under the bus and left us under the bus for decades. So hearing the make nice kind of language is kind of post-traumatic stress, for anyone who knows that history. So to help us see why appeasement without accountability is a disaster and what the moments are to redirect that energy.
Well, Joe Biden won't have the time to read Race and Reunion. It's too long a book.
Which is why we need to make it really quick so he can hear it.
I'm sorry, you bet. Well, the lesson was you cannot have healing without justice. You have to have both. And the great tragedy of Civil War memory, and it was a harrowing task, let's face it, and so is this task now. The great tragedy was that healing and justice never came in balance. The healing of the country, the reunion, if you like, came at the great cost of the victories of the Civil War. It came at the cost of Black civil and political rights. It came at the cost of a lot of lives and livelihoods. But we do need to remember here that reconciliation is a deep human instinct. It's an irresistible instinct. Watching two old soldiers shake hands that had fought against each other in a war is a little hard to resist instinctually. Now, there's a big history behind that, of course. So it's not at all surprising that Biden is going to give us a narrative of healing and unity. And we may at times, some of us on the left, have to just say, okay, Joe, you do your part. But the Congress has to do its part. It's got to pass real legislation. It's got to pass economic legislation, COVID legislation, climate legislation, environmental legislation, voting rights legislation, and make things happen, because in all likelihood, the Biden administration only has 2 more years. And I want to give a shout out to Anoa. If there's a great ray of hope in this moment, it was the electoral politics that happened in this year, 2020, in coalitions that narrowly, let's remember, won Georgia, Arizona, barely won Wisconsin, let's not forget. And even my original home state of Michigan was pretty close. So it's coalition politics, young people. Young people, it's coalition politics that changes this country. Always has.
Yeah.
And that's the lesson of Georgia.
And Joe, I want to come back for a benediction from you. What kind of leadership, what kind of leader do we need to interrupt, disrupt, create alternatives for those who are exposed to sort of follow this right-wing politics. I'm always real struck by the descriptions that you have of the marchers with, people pushing baby carriages and young people, and sort of folks who see this as part of their existential existence. What kind of equation or leadership do we need to break that, or at least to have an option for people to be exposed to alternatives that fall along the coalition politics that David is talking about?
One of the things I've been thinking just during this panel tonight, we talk on the one hand about the big lie, and on the other hand about these, kind of white racial interests. And there's a way in which there's not really a lie in some ways. People who were opposed to the election results, partly opposed them because, as Carol said, they want to delegitimize, Black and brown votes. And so there is some kind of sense of white interest there that people are following. It's that, that in some ways then the conspiracy theories just kind of are, just help do the work of people's own impulses. And so part of it is to, maybe try to refashion, part of the larger picture is that we're at a time when there's a bigger gap between the very wealthiest and everyone else as there ever has been in US history. It's like the Gilded Age and more so. And there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of precarity, there's a lot of insecurity, there's a lot of sense of state abandonment. Here in Oregon, there's big swaths of the state that don't have any 911 service, don't have any public libraries, don't have any law enforcement, and those people have turned to militias to, actually to do some of that basic work, some of the basic volunteer work, first responder work. But, part of what needs to happen, I think, for these people who are open to these kinds of appeals from the far right is to offer them some other forms of meaning, some other forms of politics, some other forms of, democratic pleasures or something else that kind of draws them in a different way that would allow them to identify not just with, kind of cramped and mean-spirited, austerity-oriented white interests, but something else, something else that's about care, it's about nurturance, it's about plenitude. And and partly, I'm not sure this will come from a leader. I think it will come from movements from below and from experiences like just happened in Georgia and, kind of broader, revivify democratic struggles from below, I hope. I don't know. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but that's, I think it's the best we got.
We have to have, some kind of prize to have our eyes on. So Carol, I'm going to come back to you for our benediction, and in a way I want to sample us from before. So the last time you were on the show, I said that, there's this sense that this is kind of like Groundhog Day. We wake up and we think it's a new day, it's a different day, we stretch, we're excited, there's an awakening, and then there's repression. And it seems like historically we kind of go through this again and again and again. So I asked you before, is it possible to write a different narrative? What is it that's holding us back? And you talked about the zero-sum game, breaking the myth of the zero-sum game. So what does Carol have to say about Carol now?
And I still hold to that. And one of the things I also think is really important for us, because we are looking into the abyss, but what we have to understand that as a larger nation, Trump never got the majority of the votes, never. And he never went above 50% in terms of approval rating, even when the economy was good and he was coasting in on Obama's economy. He still did. So that there are people, vast majority of people who are repulsed by that kind of politics. Mm-hmm. That is really something to build on. And when I talk about the zero-sum game, what it does is it pits people against each other so that you can't have those powerful coalitions, because it says that the only way that African Americans can get will be at the expense of whites, or be at the expense of Latinos, or that the only way Latinos can get will be at the expense of. And so by creating a narrative of scarcity, then what that does is it then pits people against each other. So when we think about the kinds of narratives that our media need to have, the kinds of narratives that our scholars need to have, the kinds of narratives that our policymakers must have, it is the narrative of breaking the zero-sum game. You know, Joe talked about the massive income and wealth disparities in this nation. It is not a matter of wealth. It is a matter of the distribution of that wealth. This isn't zero-sum game. There is enough abundance there for there to be 911 service in Oregon, for there to be hospitals in rural Georgia, for there to be enough food so we don't have people going hungry, being in food lines. There is enough there. And it is the narrative of the zero-sum game that creates this sense of scarcity. And when people are feeling that there's not enough there, then it puts them on high alert for how they're going to survive. We've got to think about how we thrive, and how we thrive is by breaking the zero-sum game.
And your contribution to that, that project, along with all of you, all puts us in a better position to make the myth of zero sum more apparent than ever before. So I want to thank you all for joining us. Before closing out, I want to first of all say there's so many ways that we could have gone at this, and so many aspects of this. We didn't get a chance to talk about COVID being a huge part, not to mention all of the other current challenges that so many people are fighting. And I really want to use this moment to recognize 4 people in Congress right now, who are fighting the good fight despite the conditions that they're fighting under. So Representative Jayapal, Representative Schneider, Representative Coleman are fighting under conditions that have been created because their co-congressmen seem to not be willing to look after the health of everyone. So they all have been tested as being COVID positive since last week's sheltering in place. We want to send our warmest wishes and prayers to them. And also I want to say something about my former colleague, good friend, Jamie Raskin, who's leading this fight while mourning the tragic death of his son. You all are all in our hearts and our prayers. I want to thank everyone who has made so this possible, as David so kindly highlighted. Without the time and the energy and the commitment of our team at the African American Policy Forum and the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, we wouldn't be able to do this. So I really want to thank them. And then I want to come back to Carol Anderson, David Blight, Anoa Changa, and Joe Lowndes, veterans of Under the Black Light, willing to talk through this and develop a conversation that brings you all into the center of the discourse. So I thank you for joining us. I think what's been made clear is our work is far from over, but our commitment is there, our resources are deep, and we're going to keep fighting. I want to say that we are thrilled that we have a forthcoming book with Haymarket on Under the Black Light. It is an edited collection by Daniel Hosang and myself in conjunction with the African American Policy Forum. So it will feature many of these conversations. Always, if you want to follow along the work of AAPF, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Please listen to our podcast, Intersectionality Matters. We'll be posting this conversation in the coming week. And if you haven't already done so, please take a moment to join AAPF's Truth Be Told campaign. Go to aapf.org, Truth Be Told. The histories that we've talked about, the framings that we've dealt with, All of these are ideas that this administration has tried to remove from the federal bureaucracy and anyone in any organization that works with them. So hopefully you can see how important it is to be able to talk about our history, structural racism, critical race theory, intersectionality. So support our efforts to make sure that future generations will have access to these ideas. Last but not least, if you're inspired by this evening's event and you want to partner with us to sustain these conversations, do consider donating to AAPF at aapf.org/donate. And you can write us at info.aapf to find out other ways that you can get involved. And now, to mark the premiere of the new series, we're going to close out with the amazing voice of our AAPF artist in residence, Abby Dobson. Thank you all for joining us. Until the next time, stay safe as we continue to organize and resist. Abby?
Thank you, Kim. We who believe in freedom, we will not bow down to racism. We will not bow down to injustice. We will not bow down to exploitation. I'm going to stand. I'm going to stand. I just can't tolerate racism. I just can't tolerate injustice. I just can't tolerate exploitation. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand. We will not obey racism. We will not obey injustice. We will not obey exploitation. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand for freedom. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand for freedom. I'm gonna stand. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of Black women, Black mothers, girls, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers, sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
To me, young people come first. They have the courage where we fail. And if I can but shed some light on as they carry us through the gale. I'm a woman who speaks in a voice, and I must be heard. At times I can be quite difficult. I'll bow to no man's words. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Not needing the clutch